Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. The political consciousness of younger generations is undergoing a profound transformation, not toward apathy, but toward a radical reassessment of power itself. If previous generations viewed democracy as an unshakable foundation, today's youth perceive it as negotiable, conditional, and perhaps even obsolete. This is not a rejection of democracy in principle, but an indictment of its inability to deliver tangible results. Rising economic precarity, ecological collapse, digital surveillance, and corporate influence have created a generation that no longer takes democracy's legitimacy for granted. It demands proof. A Channel 4 News survey of 13 to 27-year-olds in the UK revealed that 52% believe the nation would fare better under a strong, unelected leader, while 33% support military rule. Even more strikingly, 47% advocate for radical societal change through revolution. These numbers are not anomalies. A 2020 report by the University of Cambridge's Centre for the Future of Democracy found that millennials worldwide are more disillusioned with democracy than Generation X or baby boomers were at the same stage of life. A Global Open Society Foundation's survey similarly showed that over a third of respondents aged 18 to 35 support a strong leader who bypasses elections and legislatures altogether. This data suggests a generational shift toward post-democratic thought, a phenomenon described by political theorist Colin Crouch. In a post-democracy, the formal structures of democratic governance remain intact, but real power has shifted elsewhere, to corporations, unelected technocrats, and supranational financial institutions. Many young people sense this intuitively. Elections are still held, but policy outcomes seem preordained by forces beyond the reach of voters. What good is a vote, they ask, if economic policy is dictated by hedge funds? If environmental decisions are shaped by oil lobbies? If social policies are constrained by IMF austerity measures? In this landscape, it begins to feel like a spectacle rather than an instrument of real change. This aligns with Giorgio Agamben's concept of bare life, where citizens possess formal rights but little substantive power over their material conditions. A government may hold elections, but if wages stagnate, home ownership remains unattainable, and wealth consolidates at the top, what does democracy actually do? If participation does not lead to redistribution of power, then the distinction between democracy and oligarchy becomes increasingly difficult to defend. Zygmunt Bauman's liquid modernity offers further insight. In a world where institutions, identities, and economies are fluid, young people may no longer see static political structures as appropriate solutions. Why should democracy remain rigid if every other aspect of modernity is in flux? But crucially, this generation is not disengaging from politics. They are simply engaging differently. The conventional party system feels outdated, a relic of industrial-era governance that does not match the speed or scale of 21st century crises. Instead, young people are turning to decentralized activism, leveraging digital platforms to mobilize en masse. The global climate strikes, the George Floyd protests, and the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement all illustrate how digital native activism operates outside of traditional political channels, yet exerts immense pressure on institutions. Yet this shift to digital-first political engagement presents its own paradoxes. Social media, once hailed as a democratizing force, has also become a tool of fragmentation and ideological polarization. Jürgen Habermas's theory of the public sphere warns that democracy thrives on rational critical debate, yet the algorithmic architecture of digital platforms prioritizes emotional engagement over deliberative discourse. Viral activism can mobilize millions, but it can also create hyperpolarized echo chambers, where political engagement becomes a perpetual cycle of outrage rather than sustained governance. In the absence of institutional reform, democracy risks splitting into two irreconcilable halves: a sluggish bureaucratic system on one side and a volatile internet-fueled populism on the other. Despite this, emerging political experiments suggest alternative paths. Deliberative democracy models, such as citizen assemblies and participatory budgeting, have gained traction in cities worldwide. The idea is simple yet profound. Rather than relying solely on elections, governance can integrate continuous public input, where citizens shape policies in real time rather than waiting for infrequent elections to express their will. The philosopher James Fishkin, a key proponent of deliberative democracy, argues that direct citizen participation in policymaking could restore legitimacy to democratic institutions by ensuring governance reflects public will rather than elite maneuvering. Even more radical proposals, such as liquid democracy, where individuals dynamically delegate votes based on expertise rather than party loyalty, suggest that democracy is not necessarily dying, but mutating into something unrecognizable by 20th century standards. The question then is whether democracy can evolve fast enough to meet the expectations of a generation that refuses to be passive. If it continues to function as a closed system resistant to innovation, its legitimacy will erode further. But if it embraces new forms of participatory governance, integrating digital deliberation, decentralized decision-making, and real-time political engagement, it may yet evolve into a system that resonates with a generation unwilling to accept governance as a static inheritance rather than a dynamic, living system. If democracy is to survive this generational reckoning, it must undergo nothing short of a structural metamorphosis. The traditional model, elect representatives, wait for incremental reforms, endure bureaucratic inertia, is increasingly unpalatable in an age where crises unfold in real time. For young people accustomed to the immediacy of digital life, the sluggishness of traditional governance feels not just frustrating, but existentially inadequate. The demand is not for mere representation, but for participation, a shift from democracy as an event, elections, to democracy as a continuous process. One potential future lies in a hybrid model, merging the efficiency of centralized governance with the dynamism of decentralized decision-making. Citizen assemblies and participatory budgeting offer glimpses of this transformation. But what if democracy became truly modular and adaptive? Imagine a system where governance functioned like an open-source platform, constantly iterated upon by its citizens, where public policy was shaped through real-time deliberation, not just by elected officials, but by those directly affected. This would not eliminate the need for leadership, but redefine it. Rather than concentrating power in a ruling class, it would distribute authority dynamically, making governance more fluid, more responsive, more alive. Yet, any such transformation must grapple with a core tension: democracy's need for stability versus its need for evolution. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that political action requires a structured space in which it can unfold, lest it dissolve into chaos. This is the danger of digital activism. It is supremely effective at disruption, but often lacks the infrastructure to translate energy into sustainable governance. A revolution can overthrow a government, but can it run one? The challenge for this generation is not merely to dismantle broken systems, but to build new ones with longevity. This is where deliberative democracy could bridge the gap between agility and stability. Imagine governance structured not around rigid 4-year election cycles, but as a perpetual dialogue between government and governed, where policies are tested, adapted, and reformed in response to real-time citizen input. Digital technology makes this feasible, but institutional resistance remains formidable. The question is not whether such reforms are possible, but whether existing power structures will allow themselves to be reshaped before collapse forces reinvention. The economic dimension of this crisis cannot be overlooked. If political legitimacy is fundamentally tied to material well-being, then a democracy that fails to provide economic security risks obsolescence. This is where democracy's crisis becomes existential. The late capitalist order has created a paradox: unprecedented wealth alongside systemic precarity. Young people have more access to information, education, and global connectivity than any generation before them, yet they also face rising inequality, unaffordable housing, and diminishing social mobility. What use is political freedom if economic survival consumes all energy? If democracy is to remain viable, it must not merely protect rights, but actively redistribute power, political, financial, and structural. There is a broader, more unsettling possibility that cannot be ignored, that democracy in its current form is simply not suited to the challenges of the 21st century. Climate change, AI governance, economic collapse, these are crises that demand rapid, coordinated responses. Yet democracy as it exists today often incentivizes short-term thinking, gridlock, and incrementalism. The philosopher Nick Bostrom has suggested that humanity may soon face singleton scenarios, where decision-making is centralized under a single global authority, whether AI-driven or state-controlled, to manage existential risks. While such a future may seem dystopian, the increasing openness to authoritarian solutions suggests that, for many, the fear of democratic inefficacy outweighs the fear of centralized control. Yet, democracy's greatest strength has always been its ability to self-correct, to reinvent itself in response to its own crises. If it fails now, it will not be because its ideals were flawed, but because it did not adapt in time. The rise of authoritarian curiosity among younger generations is not a death sentence for democracy. It is a warning. A democracy that does not deliver agency, redistribute power, and function with the urgency required by modernity will not survive out of historical inertia alone. It must prove itself, not in theory, but in practice. The future of governance is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the democratic systems of the past will not survive unchanged. The only question that remains is whether democracy will evolve by design or be replaced by something entirely new, for better or for worse. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking Podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.